think I always knew, deep down, that my parents didn't love me the way they loved my younger brother, Luke. It wasn't something they ever said outright, but I felt it in the way they looked at me, like I was an obligation rather than a son. I felt it in the way they celebrated every little thing Luke did, while my own accomplishments barely registered. When Luke got in trouble at school, my parents didn't scold him. Instead, they turned to me with disappointment. Why weren't you a better role model? Why didn't you guide him? When I brought home straight A's, worked part-time, and saved up for things on my own, they barely acknowledged it. Maybe a distracted, that's nice, while they were watching TV. But when Luke managed to get a D instead of an F, they acted like he'd split the atom. One time, I overheard my mom on the phone with my aunt, bragging about how Luke had won a major award. I felt a flicker of pride. Maybe he'd actually done something impressive. When I asked him about it later, he grinned and pulled out a participation trophy for some school event he barely even attended. They threw a whole dinner to celebrate. I, on the other hand, was expected to be independent, responsible, grateful. I wasn't allowed to complain or ask for anything. If I wanted something, I had to work for it myself. If Luke wanted something, my parents found a way to get it for him. It wasn't just the big things either. It was the everyday little moments. If Luke left his dirty dishes on the table, I had to clean them up because I was older and more responsible. If I left mine, I was lazy and ungrateful. If I needed new shoes for school, my parents would tell me to use my own money. If Luke wanted the latest expensive sneakers, they magically found room in the budget. The worst part? Luke knew he was the favorite, and he loved rubbing it in. He would smirk whenever our parents took his side. He would make little comments, just loud enough for me to hear. Face it, man. You're the extra. You should be thanking me. Without me, Mom and Dad wouldn't even pretend to care about you. At some point, I stopped expecting fairness. I stopped hoping they'd ever really see me. I just kept my head down, focused on school, and told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I became successful enough, maybe one day, they'd finally respect me. That day never came. I can't even tell you the exact moment things fell apart, because, honestly, it wasn't one moment. It was a lifetime of moments. But if I had to pick the final straw, it was what happened the night Luke tried to hit me. It had been a bad week. I had just gotten some good news. My boss at work had mentioned that I might be up for a promotion soon. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something I had worked my ass off for. I came home that night feeling, for once, a little proud of myself. Then I walked in my room. My laptop was gone. At first, I thought maybe I had left it somewhere. Maybe I'd been careless. But no, the charger was still plugged in, the mouse was still sitting on my desk. I tore through my things, panic rising in my chest. That laptop wasn't just expensive, it had everything on it. My work projects, my saved passwords, years worth of personal notes. Then it hit me. Luke. I stormed into his room, and sure enough, there was my laptop sitting on his bed like it belonged to him. He didn't even look guilty. He just smirked. Relax, dude. I was just borrowing it. Without asking, I demanded. Without telling me, he rolled his eyes. You weren't even using it. That's not the point. My hands clenched into fists. Give it back. He shrugged, completely unbothered, and dropped it onto the floor with a loud thunk. I felt my stomach drop. What the hell, Luke? Oops, he said, grinning. I don't even remember grabbing him. 1 second, I was standing there, staring at my possibly broken laptop on the ground. The next, I had shoved him against the wall. What is wrong with you? I snapped. Luke's smirk widened. He wasn't scared. He should have been, but he wasn't. Ah, did I finally piss off the golden martyr? He sneered. What are you gonna do? I let go of his shirt and took a step back, breathing heavily. That's when he swung at me. I don't think he expected me to react as fast as I did. I ducked instinctively. He was too slow, too cocky. He thought he was untouchable, and maybe he was until that moment. Because for the first time in my life, I fought back. Before I could even think, my fist connected with his face. There was a sickening crack as my knuckles hit his nose. Luke let out a sharp, guttural yell, stumbling back and clutching his face. Blood started pouring between his fingers. I broke his nose. Our parents came running. And just like always, they didn't ask what happened. They didn't care who swung first. They only saw Luke bleeding and me standing there with my fists clenched. How could you attack your brother? You're a monster. After a short argument and a tantrum, they told me, get out of this house. We never want to see you again. I looked at Luke. He was still holding his nose, but through the pain, he was grinning. He knew he had won, because this wasn't about what actually happened. It never was. I could have stood there, tried to explain, tried to beg them to see the truth. But I didn't. I just turned around, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. That was the night I lost my family. Or maybe that was the night I realized I never really had one. I remember walking out of that house with nothing but my phone, my wallet, and the clothes on my back. No suitcase, no backup plan. Just the bitter realization that I had spent my entire life trying to earn love from people who never gave a damn about me. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. My hands were still shaking, adrenaline still pumping through me. Luke's blood was probably still on my knuckles. I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house I had lived in for 18 years, and I felt nothing, just emptiness. And maybe, under that emptiness, relief. For the first time, I had no expectations to meet. No hoops to jump through, no role to play. But that freedom came with a terrifying truth. I had nowhere to go. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally pulled out my phone. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Luke. I didn't even call any of my extended family. I already knew they'd heard their version of events. I snapped. I attacked Luke. I've always been jealous of my brother. I could already picture my mom sobbing on the phone with my aunts and uncles, talking about how she never saw this coming. So no, I wasn't calling family. Instead, I called the only person who had ever been in my corner, my best friend David. David picked up on the third ring. Yo, what's up? I swallowed, forcing the words out. I need a place to crash. Couch surfing and minimum wage jobs. David let me crash at his place for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of sleeping on a lumpy couch, eating instant ramen, and applying for every job I could find. I took the first job that would hire me, a shitty fast food gig that barely paid above minimum wage. The work was mind-numbing, the customers were rude, and the manager was a walking migraine. For the first time, I wasn't living under my parents' roof, following their rules. I wasn't Luke's punching bag. The next few years were brutal. I worked every shift I could get, sometimes pulling double shifts just to make ends meet. I lived off dollar menu meals and cheap rent rooms, stretching every paycheck until it practically tore at the seams. But I never complained, because every hour I worked, every dollar I saved, every miserable shift I endured, it was mine. I enrolled in night classes, barely scraping by on student loans and whatever extra cash I could spare. I studied on my lunch breaks, stayed up late writing essays, pushed through exhaustion because I knew that I had to keep going. And slowly, brick by brick, I built myself up. I climbed the ladder, moving from fast food to retail, from retail to office jobs. I networked, I learned new skills, I took every opportunity that came my way. I didn't have a safety net. I didn't have a family to fall back on. Years later, a different life. By the time I turned 26, I was unrecognizable from the kid who had walked out of that house all those years ago. I had a high-paying job, my own apartment, a car that wasn't falling apart, and a life I had built from nothing. More importantly, I had peace. No more walking on eggshells. No more chasing validation from people who never cared. No more being the family scapegoat. And I had never been happier. But then, one day, out of the blue, I got a message from my parents. And suddenly, they wanted me back. It was a normal Thursday evening. I had just gotten home from work, kicked off my shoes. My apartment was quiet, just the way I liked it. No yelling, no accusations, no walking on eggshells. Just peace. Then my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Probably spam. Or maybe David sending me some dumb meme. But then I saw the name. Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment, fingers hovering over the notification. It had been 8 years since they threw me out. 8 years of silence. 8 years of being the villain in their story. 8 years of knowing they had erased me from their lives like I never even existed. And now, just like that, they were reaching out. Mom, hey, it's been so long. We've been thinking about you a lot lately. How have you been? I read the message again, and then I laughed. Not a happy laugh. Not even an angry one. Just pure disbelief. Because after everything, after years of pretending I didn't exist, this was how they reached out? With some casual, cheery, hey, how's life? Like nothing had ever happened. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I scrolled up, looking at our last conversation. There was nothing. No old texts. No missed calls. Just an empty thread because I had deleted everything the night I walked out of that house. And now here they were, acting like we were some long-lost friends trying to reconnect. I almost left it on read. But then, before I could lock my phone, another message popped up. Dad, we need to talk. It's important. They didn't miss me. They didn't regret what they did. They needed something. I ignored them for a few days. Not out of spite. I just wanted to see how long it would take before they dropped the act. It didn't take long. By the second day, my phone was blowing up. Calls, texts, even a voicemail from my mom, her voice dripping with forced warmth. We just really want to see you, sweetheart. Let's have dinner. Just a family like old times. I almost choked on my coffee. Like old times? Did she mean the good old times where they ignored everything I did? Or maybe the great old times where they kicked me out with nothing but the clothes on my back? Yeah, hard pass. Then, on the third day, I finally got the message that told me everything I needed to know. Luke, who I hadn't spoken to since the night I broke his nose. Luke, who had always been the favorite. Now he was messaging me. Luke, hey man, I know things were rough before, but we should talk. Mom and Dad are struggling. They need help. Just be a decent person for once and step up. For once? Like I hadn't been stepping up my entire damn life? Like I hadn't spent my childhood raising myself while he got to be the spoiled golden boy? But now that they were struggling, now I was supposed to be a good son? I didn't respond. Not yet, because I wanted more details. So instead of texting back, I did a little digging. Karma hits like a freight train. It didn't take long to find out the truth. Because the thing about my family, they love to gossip. And lucky for me, some of my extended relatives still had big mouths and public social media accounts. Within an hour of scrolling, I had the full story. And God, it was beautiful. Turns out, life hadn't been so kind to Luke the golden boy. He had made some terrible financial decisions. Gambling? Maybe. Bad investments? Definitely. He had always been reckless with money, confident that no matter how much trouble he got himself into, someone would be there to bail him out. And for a while, that someone was my parents. They covered his debts, paid off his overdue bills, and even took out loans in his name, convinced that he would eventually turn things around. But he didn't. The spending never stopped. First, it was the luxury car he couldn't afford but had to have. Then it was the failed business venture that he swore would make him rich. When that didn't work, there were more bad investments, more get-rich-quick schemes, each one more disastrous than the last. And when there was no more money left, that's when the real panic set in. My father, always so proud, always so sure of his control over everything, had been forced to take out loans just to stay afloat. At first, they weren't worried. They thought they would be able to pay them off. But then, life threw another blow. My father's health had started to decline. He had always been a strong man, one of those old-school types who refused to see a doctor unless he was practically on his deathbed. By the time he finally admitted something was wrong, it was too late. The diagnosis wasn't good. A chronic illness that made working nearly impossible. He tried to push through it first, but his body simply wouldn't cooperate. The long hours he had once worked with ease became unbearable, and before long, he had to quit entirely. With my father unable to work and Luke drowning in debt, my mother tried to hold everything together. She begged the banks for extensions, reached out to family members, and even sold off whatever valuables they had left. But it wasn't enough. The mortgage payments had fallen behind. The creditors were circling. The same banks that had once been so eager to lend them money were now demanding every penny back. Their savings? Gone. Their retirement fund? Emptied. Their house? On the verge of foreclosure. They had bled themselves dry trying to protect their favorite son. And now, when they had nothing left, they suddenly remembered I existed. I let them sweat for another few days. Let them wonder if I would reply. Let them sit in their own self-made disaster, hoping I would come save them. Then, finally on a lazy Sunday afternoon, I sent a single text. Me? Sure. Let's talk. The response was instant. Mom and Dad were thrilled. Luke was suspicious, but I could practically hear their collective sigh of relief. Because in their minds, they had won. They thought I was coming back to play the good son. They had no idea what was coming. I agreed to meet them for dinner. Not because I wanted to make amends, and certainly not because I missed them. I agreed because I wanted to see it for myself. The mess they had made, the desperation on their faces, The way they would stumble through their words as they tried to pretend the last 8 years hadn't happened. I wanted to watch them beg. The restaurant they chose was painfully average, the kind of place they never would have considered when they still had money. My parents had always been snobs about things like that. If it wasn't expensive, it wasn't worth their time. But now, they didn't have the luxury of being picky. I got there early and took a seat near the window, watching as people passed by outside. The city had changed a lot since I left home, and so had I. I wasn't the kid they kicked out anymore. I had built a life for myself, one they had no part in. It was funny how quickly they had found their way back to me now that they needed something. When they walked in, I barely recognized them. My mother, who had once taken so much pride in her appearance, looked worn down, her clothes slightly ill-fitted, her hair showing more gray than I remembered. My father had lost weight, but not in a healthy way. He looked hollow, like a man carrying too many burdens. Luke, of all people, looked the worst. He had always been cocky, always walked with an air of invincibility, but now he looked anxious. I didn't stand when they approached. I didn't smile. I just watched them, waiting to see who would speak first. My mother tried to pretend this was a normal reunion, that we were just a family reconnecting after years apart. She said it had been so long, that they had missed me, that they had been thinking about me a lot lately. My father, never one for emotional displays, simply said I looked well, as if that meant anything. Luke, however, didn't bother with pleasantries. He cut right to the point, saying we all knew why we were here. That was what I had been waiting for. No need for small talk, no need for a fake warmth that none of us believed in. My father, ever the diplomat, tried to frame it as an apology. He admitted that they hadn't been the best parents, that mistakes had been made, but that at the end of the day, families should stick together. My mother echoed the sentiment, saying they had learned from the past and just wanted to move forward. I let them talk, let them stumble over their own words as they tried to rewrite history in a way that made them look less terrible. Then, finally, Luke said what I had been expecting all along. They were in trouble. The house was on the verge of foreclosure. The debts were piling up. They had exhausted every other option, and now they were coming to me. He said I had money now, that I was successful, that I could afford to help them. He said it was the right thing to do, that I should step up for my family. I let that word sit in my mind for a moment. Family. They had only remembered I existed when they needed something from me. They hadn't reached out when I was working 2 jobs to afford rent, when I was eating cheap instant noodles for weeks on end. They hadn't cared whether I was alive or dead when I was scraping by. But now that their golden child had run them into financial ruin, suddenly I was family again. I told them I would help, but only under one condition. They had to tell the truth, not just to me, but to the entire extended family. They had to admit that they had abandoned me, that they had lied about what happened, that they had spent years treating me like an afterthought, while Luke got everything handed to him. I wanted them to say it out loud, in front of everyone, and then maybe I would consider helping them. The reaction was immediate. My father scoffed, said I was being ridiculous. My mother tried to reason with me, saying that dredging up the past wouldn't change anything. Luke was furious, muttering that I was being petty, that I needed to grow up. I shrugged, told them it was their choice. If they wanted my help, that was the price. If they couldn't do it, then they would have to figure things out on their own. The desperation must have outweighed their pride, because after some back and forth, my mother finally caved. She said they would do it. She didn't look at me when she said it. A week later, they arranged a family gathering. I made sure it was in person, with as many relatives present as possible. My parents stood in front of everyone and laid it all out. How they had favored Luke for years. How they had mistreated me. How they had thrown me out with nothing and lied to the family about why. The room was silent as they spoke, the weight of their confessions settling over everyone. I watched my aunts and uncles shift uncomfortably, watched my grandmother shake her head in disappointment. My cousins exchanged glances, murmuring amongst themselves. For the first time, my parents felt what I had felt my entire life, shame. When they finished, they looked at me, waiting for my response, expecting me to finally agree to help them now that they had done what I asked, expecting me to be the good son, the bigger person. Instead, I stood up, stretched my arms, and told them I had changed my mind. The moment the words left my mouth, I could feel the shift in the room. My mother's face twisted in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as if she was trying to form words, but couldn't quite process what was happening. My father just sat there, his shoulders stiff, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles went white. Luke, on the other hand, wasn't quiet at all. He was furious. He shot up from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he glared at me, demanding to know if I was joking. I didn't even have to respond. He could see it in my face. I wasn't. The whispers started almost immediately. The rest of the family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who had sat through my parents' confession with stunned expressions, were now murmuring among themselves. Some looked at me, then at my parents, like they were reevaluating everything they had ever been told. Others simply shook their heads, unwilling to get involved. My mother, ever the manipulator, finally found her voice. She tried to appeal to me again, saying they had done what I asked, that they had swallowed their pride, that they had humiliated themselves for me. She asked how I could be so cruel, how I could just sit there and watch them suffer. I almost laughed at that. Cruel? The woman who had let me starve in my own home, who had thrown me out without a second thought, who had spent years making me feel like I was worthless. Now she wanted to talk about cruelty? Luke was still fuming, saying I was heartless, saying I was holding a grudge like a spoiled brat. That one made me smile. It was funny how easy it was for him to call me a brat when he had spent his whole life getting handed everything on a silver platter. Now that the roles were reversed, now that I was the one holding the power, he didn't like it one bit. I let them all talk. Let them rant, let them beg, let them try to twist the story in their favor. And then, when I had heard enough, I got up and left. I didn't stop. I didn't turn back. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. Word spread quickly through the family. Some people said I had done the right thing, that my parents had dug their own grave and I had no obligation to save them. Others thought I was cruel, that I should have helped them despite everything. I didn't care what they thought. Over the next few months, I heard bits and pieces about what happened to my parents and Luke. The house was foreclosed on. They had to move in with some distant relatives who weren't exactly thrilled to take them in. My father's health started declining, though I wasn't sure if that was because of stress or just karma catching up to him. Luke, predictably, blamed everything on me. They still refused to take responsibility for their own actions. Even after all this time, even after losing everything, they still somehow convinced themselves that I was the villain in their story. Now, I was living my own life, surrounded by people who actually cared about me, friends who had become my real family, a career that I had built with my own hands. And that was fine by me.